What is communion bread? I honestly don't know what's in there. I think it's probably, is it rice? I don't know if they might even not be bread. I don't even know. I would buy a box and eat them, honestly. Communion is not biblical. Well, actually, communion is biblical, and we hear about the institution of the Last Supper throughout the Gospels. Communion is not a prize for the perfect. Absolutely agree with that. You don't have to be perfect in order to commune. In fact, communion only exists because we are imperfect. If we were all perfect, we wouldn't need forgiveness of sins. We wouldn't have needed Jesus to die on the cross. And so communion really only exists because we are imperfect. So communion is not a prize for the perfect. Communion, in fact, is the way that we receive forgiveness of our sins. Communion is not a reward. That is also correct. Communion is not a reward for you doing any good works. Communion is a way, is completely God's grace coming down to us in and through the person of Jesus Christ and through the bread and the wine. So communion is not a reward. Communion is a celebration. I think that's true. I think communion is absolutely a celebration, but it's also, in a way, a time of mourning. And so it's kind of complex emotionally. Communion is absolutely a celebration that we have been forgiven, that Jesus came down and died on the cross for us, and through giving up Jesus' perfect life, we receive forgiveness of our sins. So we celebrate that, but we also mourn the fact that we are completely imperfect, that God would have to give God's only Son in order for us to be redeemed. Communion is the body and blood. This is a really, really important question. It's one of the foundational questions about what communion is. Do we believe that the physical bread and wine are truly the body and blood of Christ? Does it physically transform into Jesus' body and blood? In the Lutheran Church, we believe in consubstantiation, which is the idea that the bread and the wine contain the true essence of Jesus' body and blood. And so it is both completely bread and wine and completely Jesus' body and blood, all at the same time, which is a little bit confusing, but it's kind of like how I am completely my father's son and my brother's brother, and those two things can coexist at the same time and don't need to be mutually exclusive. Is communion symbolic? Again, for us as Lutherans, we don't believe that it is purely symbolic. We believe that there is symbolism inside of what communion is, but no, communion is not just purely symbolism. Should communion be open or closed? I think when answering this question, I need to define quickly what open and closed communion is. And so open communion is when everybody, regardless of who they are, regardless of their religion, regardless of anything else, might come and receive communion. Closed communion is only certain people can receive communion. So should communion be opened or closed is really a matter of your tradition. And typically, communion has been a closed affair. It's been something that only is done with certain people. In fact, when I go to Catholic services, when I go to Catholic Mass, I don't go up and receive communion because my faith in that the body and blood are not physically the body and blood of Christ, and it doesn't match what the Catholics believe, and they actually wouldn't even serve me communion if they knew that, and I feel like it's honoring their tradition for me not to receive communion in a Catholic church. So I personally tend towards open communion. However, I know that there are some exceptions to that in the Lutheran tradition, but I tend to say that anybody, that all people are welcome to take communion. And what I remember and what I think about a lot is the eunuch on the road who asks, what is preventing me from being baptized? I think, what is preventing a person from taking communion? And there would be very few things that I would think would be good excuses for somebody for us to bar somebody from taking communion here at St. John's. Should communion be taken every Sunday? Well, it's not a prescription. We don't need to take communion every Sunday. And I think that God's grace is big enough that we don't need to use our last gasp, dying breath in order to ask for forgiveness. We don't need to receive communion during our dying breath in order to be forgiven. We don't need to have our last rites given to us right at the moment of death in order for us to find our way into heaven, because what we're really dependent upon is God's grace and God coming down to us and extending God's grace to us. And so when it comes to whether communion should be taken every Sunday, that's more a matter of us and whether that's important for who we are, not whether it's important for us to be saved. It's not a matter of salvation. It's really more a matter of our personal preferences. Should communion be taken at home? In the Lutheran tradition, Luther actually was not somebody who supported at-home communions. We do private communions for people who are homebound, but otherwise in the Lutheran tradition, communion is something to be held within our community during public worship. Who should take communion according to the Bible? Well, Jesus absolutely offers communion to his disciples and therefore offers it to anyone who would follow him. Who should administer communion? In the ELCA, in the Lutheran Church, we believe that it is the job of pastors, bishops, or people who are ordained for the ministry of word and sacrament to do communion, to administer communion. When should communion be taken? And when should communion be done? Communion should be taken or done as part of a public service, as part of a community. It's one of the ways that we celebrate together and remember together and practice as a community what it's like to live a life of discipleship. Why should we receive communion on the tongue? That's a really important one. We receive communion on the tongue, or we receive communion with our hands out like this as a show of supplication that we are passively receiving. We are not taking communion. We do not take salvation for ourselves. Salvation and forgiveness of sins can only be given to us by God. Thanks everyone for watching. This has been another episode of St. John's Autofill Interview, and we would like to hear your questions so that we can use them in a future upcoming episode of St. John's Autofill Interview. I guess it would be more like St. John's email interview. So please feel free to email me at Pastor Jerod at stjohns-shakopee.com. You can also look that up on our website, or you can tweet at me, and that's just at Jerod Freeberg. Thanks.